Thank you for listening to SPN, the Savage Podcasting Network.
You're listening to the Stephen Savage Show on the Savage Podcasting Network. And now here's your host, film and television director, Stephen Savage.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everyone to another episode of the Stephen Savage Show on the Savage Podcasting Network, the official podcast of the Idlewild International Festival of Cinema and the Scotland International Festival of Cinema, coming to you as always from Lunatopia Studios at Chateau Esteban in the beautiful alpine village of Idlewild, California. Just a 2-hour drive east of Los Angeles, but a world away at just under 6,000 feet, high atop Mount San Jacinto and overlooking the great Coachella Valley. And we have another special feature edition for you today, another episode of Fatal Gothic, the true crime history podcast that I created along with my partner, actress and voiceover artist Julia Parker. And lo and behold, Julia is on the phone from her home in Los Angeles, calling in to help me introduce this episode. Julia, how are you?
Hey, Stephen, I'm doing great. Thank you.
This episode of Fatal Gothic is one of my personal favorites of all the episodes we've produced. It's entitled Bass Reeves, Charlie Next Moon, and the Indian Territory Murders. And Julia, I think this is perhaps one of my top 5 favorite Fatal Gothic episodes you and I have ever produced. I absolutely loved researching and then writing this one. It was an absolute pleasure for me to do.
It was so good. It was one of my top ones also, and I just really loved voicing Nellie Reeves.
Right.
She was amazing.
Yeah, Bass Reeves' wife. She's another one that just kind of got sort of lost to history until recently. And a little bit more about Bass Reeves, and you'll learn much more about this great American lawman in this episode. Bass was the first African-American federal marshal and a legend literally in his own time. I know there were dime novels and comics written about his exploits even when he was alive. And somehow he was lost to history to a great extent. But in recent years, people have rediscovered the man and his career. And we're proud to have stumbled upon this rare chapter in his life. This was one of those cases that he was involved in that was really more than just dangerous. It was like a life changer for him. Mm-hmm. But Julia, let's also talk about one of his crime-busting partners that plays such an important role in this case, and that's a man named Charlie Next Moon.
Yeah, Charlie Next Moon. He was a Cherokee tribal policeman with what was called the Light Horseman Regiment. And he was stationed at Tahlequah Prison in the Oklahoma Territories from just after the Civil War until his retirement in the late 1880s. And he and Bass Reeves worked on many cases together in that period, including the one we focus on in this episode.
Right. And in this episode tells of the case of a serial killer, though that term wouldn't be coined by the FBI for another 90 years. But this man's reign of terror had Bass and Charlie back on the trail together again in 1881, trying to track this guy. So let's play the episode in its entirety, and then Julia and I will be back to talk about it afterwards. Sound good, Julia?
Sounds good.
And we'll warn you, this episode contains depictions of graphic violence in the words of the participants themselves, so listener discretion is advised. So here it is, Fatal Gothic, a true crime history podcast. Bass Reeves, Charlie Next Moon, and the Indian Territory Murders. Enjoy.
This is Fatal Gothic. Case histories of pre-20th century serial killers, long hidden in the dark corners of time. Serial killer. A term coined by FBI agents in the 1970s to describe one who kills randomly, kills strangers, over a period of weeks or months or even years. But serial murder was not a 20th century phenomenon alone. Far back in the annals of time, before Jack the Ripper or H.H. Holmes, every country throughout recorded history has experienced the horror of senseless murder perpetrated by a killer without a face. My co-host for the podcast is film and television director Stephen Savage.
And my co-host is actress, voiceover artist, and television personality Julia Parker. In the spring of 1881, Martha Tallfeather and her 14-year-old daughter Iris were found naked, raped, and drowned in a community water tank in the Indian Territories of southeastern Oklahoma. The women were late returning home from fetching water, and family and tribal members immediately embarked on a search. The bodies were discovered late morning floating face down in the open tank, with all signs pointing to a lone white man as being the murderer. The hoof tracks around the tank were definitely from a white man's horse, not an Indian pony, and there was found an empty store-bought tobacco pouch and spent wooden matches lying on the ground nearby. The family sent a message to the Cherokee Tribal Police, or Light Horseman Brigade as they were called, at Telequan Prison, 60 miles away. The tribal officer sent to investigate the crime was a veteran of the Civil War and a seasoned law enforcement officer named Charlie Next Moon. Charlie as well could see right off that the crime was committed by a white man, and knowing that federal law mandated that any crime investigation involving a white perpetrator, even on Indian land, must be headed up by a federal officer. This normally meant a white man. Charlie put little trust in white federal officers, especially after having fought on the side of the Confederacy in the war, and knowing full well his tribe's history of horrid treatment by the federal government. But he knew of one federal cop he could call on that he did trust. That man was Bass Reeves, the first black federal law enforcement officer in U.S. history. When Bass Reeves was born into slavery in Arkansas in 1838, no one could have guessed what a great man he would grow up to be. Bass was a rambunctious child, and as he said of himself to an Oklahoma newspaper in 1901, "My lack of fear as a boy near drove my mother to an early grave, but my father was proud as a rooster." Once, when the white overseer of the property the Reeves family belonged to was about to whip Bass for beating up his two sons, both whom were much bigger than the young slave boy, Bass spoke up and said, "Why are you beating me? They the ones lost the fight." The overseer apparently found this hilarious, and in a fit of laughter told Bass to run along without being whipped. Such was the personality of Bass Reeves, fearless and confident even in the face of slavery. He never let anyone get the better of him. When the Civil War began in 1861, Bass's master was commissioned into the Army of Alabama as a colonel and dragged Bass with him. Bass was not thrilled. Sometime in 1862, Bass learned of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and informed the colonel that he now considered himself a free man. The colonel, outraged by Bass's impertinence, announced he would have him whipped the next morning. Bass attacked the colonel, knocking him unconscious and escaping into the Oklahoma Territories, where he was taken in by a group of Cherokee who hid him out and taught him the ways of living off the land, eventually making him an honorary member of the tribe. During his time with the Cherokee, Bass became a superb horseman, both in the saddle and bareback, an expert tracker, and a deadly shot with a rifle and with a handgun. To top it all off, Bass became fluent in 5 Native American languages, all skills that would serve him well in the years to come. Bass remained under the protection of the Cherokee until the end of the war, making lifelong friends with many in the tribe, including Charlie Next Moon.
Bass Reeves eventually left Oklahoma and returned to Arkansas, where he would rejoin his mother and father, both now free, and take up farming. It was during a trip to Texas with his father to buy livestock that Bass met his future bride, a beautiful, educated young lady named Nellie Jenny. Bass had never learned to read or write, so Nellie's spirit and brains impressed him very much. For her part, she saw Bass as a solid man who could head up a family as both protector and provider. What he lacked in schooling, he more than made up for in intelligence and work ethic. After only a week of courtship, she agreed to move to Arkansas and marry him. Nellie and Bass would have 11 children in all, and their life together would be chronicled not just in the newspapers and dime novels that featured his tales of heroic deeds, but in the diaries Nellie kept throughout their entire marriage. It was a match made in heaven, and as Bass would later say in life, knowing that Nellie was waiting for him at home, provided him with a reason to, in his words, not get killed. It may seem overly sweet and fanciful, but it worked. In Bass Reeves' entire career as a lawman, in countless gunfights, and over 3,000 arrests of some of the baddest men in the country, he never took a single bullet. How Bass Reeves went from a farmer to lawman is an interesting story in itself. In 1875, a man named James F. Fagan was appointed U.S. Marshal in charge of the Indian Territory, which included Arkansas and Oklahoma. He was on the lookout for capable men with certain skills to deputize for his new police force. He put out an advertisement in every newspaper in the region. The advertisement was read by none other than Nellie Reeves. She told her husband, whose skills she was well aware of, about the position and informed him of the pay being offered, 5 times what he was earning as a farmer. Bass, always wanting to improve his life for his wife and children, had Nellie write a letter to Fagan offering his services, adding nothing of the fact that he was black. Within a week, Bass was offered a job interview with the new U.S. Marshal's Office for Arkansas and the Oklahoma Indian Territories. Bass Reeves was a bold man, knowing he couldn't keep his skin color a secret for long, and that a black deputy might not be acceptable to the new marshal out of hand, no matter what his skills. Bass decided to announce himself in such a way he couldn't be denied. As soon as he arrived at the new federal building in Oklahoma, he rode up and down the road in front of the marshal's office, twirling his pistols, shooting in the air, and performing a series of trick riding stunts meant to awe the potential boss. Everyone in the office came out to see what was happening and were treated to what Fagan later recalled as, quote, a display of horsemanship and pistolero prowess such as I've never before seen, unquote. Bass pulled his horse up to where Fagan and his staff were standing, jumped from his saddle, and greeted everyone in fluent Cherokee. He was, of course, hired on the spot without prejudice. Bass Reeves was now a United States Marshal.
As was mentioned earlier in the podcast, Nellie Reeves was a dedicated diarist and kept an ongoing record of her life with Bass, but some of the darkest entries in her journals center around the case Bass was called to head up by Charlie Nextmoon, the case which began with the murder of Martha Tallfeather and her daughter Iris, a case which would escalate even before Bass was packed up and on his way to meet up with Charlie. Nellie wrote in her diary,
Mr. Reeves received orders today from Marshal Fagan. It was on account of a letter sent from my husband's friend, Charlie Nextmoon, the Indian policeman in Oklahoma that is well known to me through stories my husband has shared. It appears there are 2 Indian women murdered on Thursday last, and now a 3rd woman has been discovered, for which white men are believed to be the perpetrators, though no clear suspects have yet been identified. As a yet unknown white is the presumed culprit in these crimes, by law, a deputy of the U.S. Marshal's Office must partake in the investigation. Charlie Nextmoon has requested that my husband be sent, as he knows the area well and speaks fluently in the Cherokee tongue. The first 2 women murdered were of that tribe. They were raped, and the order states, drowned afterwards. One of them was only 14 years old. It troubles my soul to read of such things. This world can be terribly ugly at times, and my husband's job puts him often square in the middle of it. The 3rd victim was a white woman, a school teacher giving lessons in letters and mathematics to the Indian children. She too was raped and then strangled with her own shawl. I'm proud that my husband is so well thought of in his profession, and he works tirelessly to retain that fine reputation. But I must admit to feeling dread whenever he is called upon to perform the dangerous tasks routinely involved in the tracking down of killers. Though he is well suited to this and superbly qualified, a wife cannot help but feel deep worry in her heart when such assignments are handed down to her man. But as he has told me so many times, he has a duty to uphold, and he would no more shirk away from it than he would cut off his own hand. But this particular assignment, this one, for some reason, has me trembling inside, and I can't put a finger on just why that is. But he has a duty, and I have mine, which is to keep faith in the Lord and in my husband's resolute nature. I will trust in both. Nellie Reeves, April 13th, 1881.
Bass arrived by train to the Tahlequah, Oklahoma prison 2 days after Nellie's diary entry. He carried with him 2 Winchester rifles, 2 Colt Navy model revolvers, a Remington Derringer, and his saddle. That night, after choosing a horse from among the garrison's herd, he and Charlie Next Moon met up to discuss what info Charlie had on the 3 murders, and to plot out a course of action. There was no need for Bass to investigate the murder locations himself, as Charlie's reports were quite thorough, and Bass trusted his friend's insight as well as his own. Charlie revealed it was his belief that only one man was responsible for these crimes, and that if he had to guess from the evidence carelessly left behind at the crime scenes, and by the way the schoolteacher, a 26-year-old woman named Mrs. Snyder, was strangled with her own shawl and left tied to a post outside her cabin, the killer was not Indian. In addition, the knot on the rope that held her wasn't one a Cherokee would normally use. Plus, after examination of the horseshoe prints, which were made by a well-shod animal, Charlie deduced that the killer was more than likely military. There was only one Army garrison within a rideable range of the murder locations. That was Fort Gibson, which housed both the all-white 7th Cavalry, still trying to redeem itself after the Little Bighorn incident 6 years earlier, and one of the famous Buffalo Soldier regiments, the 9th Cavalry, which had been sent to Oklahoma the year before after fighting gallantly against the Kiowa in West Texas. Ironically, the all-black 9th had not been sent to Oklahoma to fight Indians, but to prevent white settlers from encroaching into Indian territory. Charlie Next Moon was of the opinion that either a white or a black soldier was responsible for the murders of the women, and so, on the morning of April 16, 1881, Deputy Marshal Bass Reeves and Cherokee tribal policeman Charlie Next Moon set off on horseback to Fort Gibson to see if they might identify a suspect from among the soldiers at the fort. Thus began one of the most famous manhunts in Oklahoma history.
Upon arrival at Fort Gibson on the afternoon of April 18, 1881, Bass and Charlie were presented to Colonel Edward Hatch, filling him in on their investigation and why it had led them to his doorstep. It seems Hatch was quite willing to allow them to question his colored soldiers, as they were called, but was a bit reluctant to allow a thorough look into the 7th, using the excuse that, after Custer's loss of the Little Bighorn, the reputation of the 7th needed boosting, and having a murderer emerge from that outfit would prove detrimental to that goal. But if an investigation must be done, he preferred they work through one of his white officers, so that white soldiers wouldn't be subjected to questioning by a black man and his Indian cohort. Bass was not agreeable to this. He was a sworn officer of the court and would do his duty without interference from anyone, including an Army colonel. The investigation might have ended right then and there, had it not been for Charlie Next Moon, who, being accustomed to the prejudicial ways of the Army in the 1880s, and having learned from experience how to get around it, informed the colonel they'd be happy to work closely with a white officer, so long as that officer understood the gravity of the situation, adding that one of the 3 murder and rape victims was a white woman. Hatch eased up a bit after being reminded of this, and became much more cooperative. And so it was planned that interviews of any soldier who had been given leave in the past week or had left the fort alone on official Army business would begin the next day. A young lieutenant named Simmons was ordered to schedule the interviews in the enlisted men's mess hall and to pull the records of any soldier who fit the criteria. The investigation into what would become known as the Indian Nation murders had begun.
A letter arrived for Nellie Reeves on April 20th, 1881. It was from her husband, Bass. He was about to embark on a mission to track down a killer. Bass, always mindful of Nellie's wish that she never be left in the dark, no matter how unpleasant or dangerous any given assignment might be, laid out what had happened since his arrival in Oklahoma and what he and Charlie's plans were moving forward. His wife was his closest confidant, as Nellie's diary entry on the day the letter arrived attests to. It is both chilling and informative, and gives us an accounting of events more personal and telling than any official report ever could. Nellie wrote,
I received a letter today from Mr. Reeves, oddly enough at first on U.S. Army stationery, informing me of his safe passage into Indian country and detailing events as they occurred after his arrival. He and Charlie Nextmoon now have a suspect in the murders of the 3 women and are riding off to capture him. The man is a soldier assigned to Fort Gibson with the 7th Cavalry. Bass informed me that the 9th Cavalry, a colored regiment, is also garrisoned there, and he was all but praying that a suspect wouldn't be found among those men, as it would break his heart to think a black regiment, as well known for valor in the field as the 9th, would produce such a cold-blooded killer. But it appears the culprit is a white man, a soldier named Augustus Ham. He came to be the main suspect when he fled the fort before he could be questioned. Interviews of some of the soldiers was announced to be held on the 19th. This Ham fellow was not at roll call that morning, and a few of his fellow soldiers reported he had volunteered for mounted sentry duty the night before, apparently using the opportunity to escape, unseen, into the darkness. Others among his units stated that Ham had bragged to them about a sordid encounter he had had with a teacher of one of the reservation schools, consequences that seemed to be enough for Mr. Reeves to announce him the foremost suspect. After procuring a signed release of legal responsibility from the fort's commander, meaning that my husband and Charlie Nextmoon are free to hunt and bring to trial Augustus Ham outside of military jurisdiction and protocol. They are now off to pursue this man on their own terms and under civil law.
Bass and Charlie set off from Fort Gibson into the wilderness of Indian Territory on the afternoon of April 19, 1881. Bass had sent out telegraph warnings to every military fort and law enforcement office within a 200-mile radius. But in truth, there were few established towns in Oklahoma at the time, and what settlers there were mostly led isolated lives on large land claims with few or no neighbors, and it was renegade Indians they feared, not murdering white men. And getting a mass warning out to these people was impossible. This worried Bass to no end. They were hunting a cold-blooded killer with no regard for human life, and having little or no chance of being discovered, he could murder at will, and his crimes might go undiscovered for weeks, if not longer. But Augustus Ham did have one huge disadvantage. He was being followed by 2 of the best trackers in the United States. Just a day after leaving Fort Gibson, Charlie picked up the tracks of a horse he was sure belonged to Ham. The tracks led northeast, away from either Texas or Arkansas, where military outposts were in abundance. Since Ham's army record stated he was originally from Missouri, it wasn't hard to guess where he was headed. But Missouri was at least a 3 days' ride from where they had picked up the trail, and the lawmen were certain they could catch up with their suspect before he was out of Indian Territory. But whom might he meet along the way? What possible victims might Augustus Ham encounter between that moment and when Bass and Charlie caught up to him? They picked up the pace and followed. The next day, after only 5 hours of rest and a meal, the lawmen were back in the saddle, closing the miles between themselves and the man they pursued. Mid-morning on April 21st, Bass and Charlie rode up to a small ridge on a hill overlooking a farmhouse on the Arkansas River near present-day Westport, Oklahoma. It was a rather brisk morning, yet no smoke could be seen coming from the chimney, and no movement of humans could be detected, odd for a working farm at that time of day. A few cows roamed about freely, and 2 draft horses stood idle in a corral near the barn, but there was no other movement. As the lawmen descended the hill and reached the house, they spotted the bodies of 2 dogs, both shot a number of times. Bass and Charlie cautiously dismounted, pulling their weapons, with Charlie moving off to explore the barn, and Bass heading into the house. What they found, what Bass would later report to the U.S. Marshal's office, would have, as he said years later, straightened the hairs of even a wire-knotted scalp like mine. It would affect Bass for the rest of his life, and haunt the dreams of even the hardest lawmen in the territories for decades.
Not much is known about Charlie Next Moon, other than what Bass said of him in newspaper interviews and in his stories to Nellie, which she diligently put down in her diaries. The Cherokee tribal police didn't keep clear records of crime investigations and the like. Mostly, they would simply and without fanfare hunt down a criminal when ordered and bring him in for trial if possible. The rest of their duties involved keeping the peace among the tribe's members and assisting federal marshals or the army if asked. This case at least brought some well-deserved notoriety to Charlie's work, as Bass made sure his superiors understood the invaluable role Charlie played in bringing an end to Augustus Ham's murder spree. When Bass entered the farmhouse, he spotted the body of a man, whose name he'd later learn was Royce Newhall. Mr. Newhall was laying flat on his stomach, with a short-handed hatchet sticking out of the back of his skull. He had been struck from behind and was probably dead before he hit the floor. Blood had pooled and dried around the body, with a narrow stream that led away from the man and along the east-facing wall of the main room. Bass, a Colt pistol in his hand, slowly walked into another room at the back of the house. There, laying out on a blood-stained bed, her clothes completely ripped away and her throat severed, was Elizabeth Newhall, the farmer's wife. A long wooden spoon was protruding from her vagina, and a large butcher knife, probably the one used to cut her throat, was stuck in her chest, the blade having been plunged into her heart. Bass turned and entered another small room. There he found no bodies, just 2 small beds and a number of dolls sitting on them. A few books, like those used to teach letters to children, were laying on a short bench in the corner. Bass opened one of them. On the inside cover were written 3 names. Though he couldn't read them, the juvenile scribble told him what he needed to know. These were the names of children. It was then that he heard Charlie's voice coming from the barn. Charlie rarely allowed his voice to rise above a soft murmur. He would always whistle loudly if he needed to get your attention from far away. But this was a holler, a strenuous call from deep down inside. Bass, with the book in his hands, immediately rushed out the front door to see what the matter was.
Hurrying into the barn, Bass was stopped cold in his tracks by what he witnessed. Charlie Next Moon was on his knees, rocking back and forth, singing a Cherokee death song. There in front of him, hanging by their necks from ropes tied to a high center beam, were 2 little girls. These were Hannah and Rebecca Newhall, aged 7 and 9. They were naked and had obviously been marched up the ladder to the hayloft, the ropes tied around their necks, and then pushed from the loft and left to strangle. The sun, peeking through the spaces in the roof, sending shards of dusty light across the bodies, gave the entire vision, as Bass would later tell Nellie, a demonic air. Bass stood for a long moment, silent, growing angrier and more determined by the minute. Charlie finished his song and stood. Bass said to his friend, "There's one missing." He handed the book to Charlie, who could read and write in English quite well, much of his childhood having been spent in the reservation schools. He looked at the names in the book, then looked to the ground, swinging the barn door open wider so as to shine light on the dirt. Bass then saw what he was looking at: 2 sets of footprints, one adult with large boots and one smaller, a barefoot girl leading out of the barn together. The smaller tracks were not as tiny as the girl's hanging from the beam, but not full-grown either. These were the tracks of 13-year-old Rachel Newhall, the oldest daughter of the slain couple in the house. It makes one shudder to think of the horror this poor teenage girl had witnessed. To watch her parents butchered, her mother raped, and then to be forced into the barn to watch this man, this brutal killer, Augustus Ham, hang her 2 little sisters. And now she was gone, taken away by this same man for who knew what purpose. According to Bass's later statements, he started to mount up that very moment and light out after Ham to save Rachel before it was too late. But Charlie stopped him, saying their own horses needed rest. Worn-out animals would do them no good. The bodies were fresh. Ham was only a few miles ahead of them now. They would wait a couple of hours or so, and then run down their prey before nightfall and rescue the girl. Bass knew Charlie was right. His anger was getting in the way of his professionalism. Charlie patted him on the shoulder and said softly to his friend, "We have graves to dig." 2 hours later, Bass Reeves and Charlie Nexmoon were mounted up and on their way. The tracks of 2 horses led away from the farm. Obviously, Rachel had been put on one of the farm horses and forced to ride with her kidnapper. Her abductor's plan was more than likely to keep the girl alive, after who knows what tortures and degradation she would have to endure. Then Ham would either murder her, though Bass thought this unlikely, as he could have simply killed her at the farm with the rest of the family, or, more likely, he would sell her to Comancheros or some other of the gangs of desperate men that roamed the plains between Kansas and Missouri. The subject was moot, as Bass Reeves wasn't about to allow either scenario to take place. As Charlie had stated, they would catch up to Ham before nightfall, and end this brutal fiend's reign of terror once and for all. But something had changed in Bass at that farm. Perhaps it was the thought of his own daughters back home, or simply that he hadn't seen in all his career such brutality against innocent people. He told his partner, "I ain't sure, Charlie, but the way I'm feeling, the odds ain't good of that son of a bitch making it back alive."
The reports that were filed with the marshal's office after Bass's return, dictated to the watch commander, and put into the official report are quite detailed, and the follow-up is more than a bit bewildering after 140 years. The report reads as follows, from Bass Reeves' own words.
My partner, Light Horseman Charlie Nexmoon, and me came upon the culprit Ham and the captive girl just after dusk. The man had built a fire so large it would have been visible from the moon. It's important to note that he was unaware he was being hunted and believed he was days ahead of anyone on his trail. After all, he'd fled Fort Gibson during the night and perhaps felt he was too far gone up the road for anyone to latch hold of his track. He made a miscalculation there. Charlie and myself dismounted a ways off from his camp so our horses wouldn't give us away, and moved off to approach him from 2 different directions. I crept slow and low to about 50 feet of him. The plan was to rush him and hold him by strength before he could take up arms, but that possibility was removed by Ham's own actions. He approached the girl, who he had roped to his saddle, now on the ground, to keep her from getting free. He untied her wrists, dragged her across the dirt, and stood her up against a tree. I could see he was forcing kisses on her, dropping his suspenders so as to let fall his trousers, and directing her hand forcibly to parts of his own person that a young girl shouldn't be made to touch. This is when I realized he planned to have his way with her. I could no longer wait for a calculated attack. I called out his name, and he turned and went for his guns. He was still in a state of undress and tripped over his own clothing, but when he rose he had a pistol and began to fire in my direction. Charlie, who had come up on my left side, fired a shot I guess meant only to wound him so we might bring him in injured but alive. The shot missed its mark, and he then turned his fire toward Charlie. I returned fire after jumping behind a skinny tree for cover. Before we knew it, Ham had grabbed up his breeches and was trying to climb aboard his horse without a saddle. For a moment, he gave clear outline of himself against the firelight, and I took my shot. I managed a headshot, and he fell. Charlie comforted and reassured the girl as I established that there was no life left in Ham. Our goal was to take him alive, but the girl's welfare held preference over that. I take full responsibility for the killing of Ham, but I do not apologize for my actions. I acted in a way warranted by the circumstances. This report I swear to as a duly appointed officer of the courts of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the Indian Territories. Respectfully, Bass Reeves, United States Deputy Marshal, April 26, 1881.
Bass was never questioned further than this report. Charlie Next Moon was never called in to clarify or to follow up with a report of his own. This would have been protocol, even in 1881, and the records show that most cases of deputy-involved shootings by U.S. Marshals were followed up with official inquiries. Rachel Newhall, likewise, was never asked to give her account of events, even of the murder of her family. She was quietly sent to live with her mother's sister in Fort Worth, Texas, and was lost in history. Two possibilities for this. One, Bass was so highly thought of by his boss, Marshal Fagan, that his word of the events was good enough to stand as fact. Unlikely, in lieu of how other cases were handled at that time. No, it's more likely that this was Bass Reeves' first killing on duty of a white man, and Fagan was concerned that the prejudices of the time would hold that a black man taking the life of a white, even under the auspices of the law, would in all likelihood cost him one of the best men under his command. So the report stands to this day as the official account of the case of the hunt for and killing of Augustus Ham. Who knows how many people Ham murdered in the wilderness before these events took place? But if ever the term serial killer was well placed, it was upon the name Augustus Ham. Bass Reeves continued as a lawman for nearly 40 years and became an icon of the Old West until somehow his legend was lost to history for decades, until just recently, when a resurgence of interest in his life has begun to take hold. There have in recent years been movies, books, and internet blogs singing the praises of this great American. Bass died in 1910, leaving behind a legacy that will stand for eons to come. His descendants have done quite well. They include the great-nephew, Paul L. Brady, who became the first black man appointed as a federal administrative judge in 1972. Bass is also the great-great-grandfather of NHL hockey player Ryan Reeves. His life with Nellie was a happy one. Unfortunately, he outlived his beloved wife as she passed away in 1896. No one is quite sure what happened to Charlie Next Moon after about 1890. He remained a policeman until his retirement in 1888 due to complications of gunshot wounds received from his son, who accidentally shot his father while the two were hunting. No record of his death or gravesite has ever been found. There is a side note to this story that our listeners will find quite interesting. In the years following the case laid out in this episode, Bass Reeves and Charlie Next Moon worked on many cases together, traveling the vast wilderness of the Indian Territories and beyond, and tales of their heroic escapades were well documented in newspaper stories and dime novels in the late 19th century. So much so that many historians believe these exploits are the basis for a very well-known pair of partners in comic books, movies, television, and radio programs in the 20th century, the stories of the Lone Ranger and his pal Tonto. Wouldn't it be amazing if it turned out that the real Lone Ranger was a black man named Bass Reeves, and the real-life Tonto was a Cherokee policeman named Charlie Next Moon? It makes one wonder. I'm Julia Parker.
And I'm Stephen Savage. Fatal Gothic is researched and written by myself and Julia Parker, and produced at Lunatopia Studios in Idlewild, California. Fatal Gothic can be found on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Pandora. Thank you for listening. Such a great story, and the input from Nellie Reeves, and so much, it just adds so much to the entire thing. We're fortunate that her diaries and journals still survive to this day in the Oklahoma State Archive. She really was a fine stylist. The detail in her writing is just amazing.
And I really love the fact that you could learn more about her when you listen to this episode, between how long they dated to how many children they had. Mm-hmm. And I just really loved voicing her. She was amazing.
Yeah, just an amazing woman. I'd like to even learn more about her. And I love the thought that Bass and Charlie might very well have been the models for the Lone Ranger and Tonto. I find that absolutely fascinating.
So interesting.
It just blew my mind when we were doing the research and I found that out. It was just incredible to me. I got such a big smile on my face, and it still makes me happy to think about that.
I got a kick out of it.
Yeah. So there you are, another special edition, Fatal Gothic episode on the Stephen Savage Show. We hope you enjoyed it. So for Julia Parker and myself, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you, everybody, for listening.